In 2002 I had to work as a nurse at a nursing home for a whole year as part of my nursing course. I knew the job would be difficult, but I needed to do it if I wanted my degree. Over time, I got used to working there, and I really started to have a certain friendship, both with the other members of the staff and with the patients themselves. Loneliness is one of the most common ailments that affect those patients. Often they were thrown there by their families and forgotten. So, part of our work was a rotation of conversations. We had specific times when we would go to patients and talk to them about any topic. Occasionally the supernatural was the subject, and many of those old men had stories about it. Then I put together some stories that were told there, and even one that happened to me there. The first story that I remember came from an old woman called Grace. This lady had an interesting hobby. She made rag dolls using crochet. Once, I was talking to her, and I asked her what made her start that hobby. She said that one day her daughter got a rag doll as a gift from the school. At that time not all people had money to buy toys for children, so it was normal to build small toys, both by the parents and by the children themselves, using homemade materials, such as skins and others. So you can imagine the joy of that little girl when she got a real rag doll. It was amazing for her. The girl became very attached to the doll, and would not let go of it anymore. Time passed and one day Grace noticed that her daughter's little nightgown, which she wore to sleep, was singed, as if it had been exposed to fire or great heat. So Grace decided to ask her daughter what had happened to the nightgown to make it look like that. The little girl innocently told her that her doll had taken her to a very hot place, and that she said it was hell. Grace was startled but didn't believe it. After a few more days, another nightgown appeared singed just like the first, and the little girl insisted that it was the doll that had taken her to hell during the night. Grace, already scared, then decided to stay on the lookout for a few nights to see what happened. For the first few days nothing happened to her, until one night, after the little girl went to sleep, she heard a noise and went to see what was happening. She looked in horror through a crack in the door, and saw the doll walking hand in hand with her daughter and out the front door. Frightened and terrified, Grace didn't do anything for the time being, afraid something worse would happen to her daughter. With the dawn of the day and her daughter back at home, Grace took the doll and completely tore it up, setting fire to what was left of its debris, putting an end to that nightmare, and she would never forget that horrible experience. And from then on, she always made the dolls her daughter had. This next story was told by a gentleman named Lorenzo. Lorenzo was one of the most iconic figures in the place. Completely without family, he was a gentleman with a strong Italian accent and an even stronger personality. With Alzheimer's he alternated between good and bad days. Some days he was completely sober and knew how to tell even episodes from his childhood, other days he barely remembered our names. When sober, he was bossy and spoke a lot of bad words, but he never directed them at us. Well, he did call us a sissy from time to time. One of the things he used to say was, "The good part about Alzheimer's is that I meet new people almost every day." So you can tell he was a lively one. But the rumors surrounding this man were not pleasant. At 89 years old, some said he had served during World War II for Mussolini's Italy, and then worked for the Mafia. In fact, Lorenzo had traveled all over the world, and he had a few scars, including a nasty one on his leg, which they said had been made by a bullet. On that day, we were talking about his travels, until we got to the subject of beaches. He widened his eyes and said, "I don't go near beaches." I questioned why was that, and then he told me this story. This fact occurred on a beach in the United Kingdom, which faces an island named after a saint. That's how he described it. One night he was doing a job at another fellow's summer house, staying late into the night. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, he decided to return home. As the hotel he was staying at was about 500 meters from the place, on the edge of the beach, he preferred to refuse the invitations for a ride, and preferred to walk alone along the beach. So he got out of there, and started walking. It was a clear and pleasant night, mainly because he was walking along the beach. It was a remote beach, so even during the day there wasn't much movement. After walking a few steps, he saw about 20 meters away a very pretty girl, all dressed in white, coming towards him. He continued on his way and watched the girl. At one point, he lowered his head so as not to intimidate the girl, as she could be scared of someone watching her at that hour of the night and in such a remote place. However, realizing that she was very close, he looked straight ahead again. And the woman in white was gone. There was nowhere for her to go as it was a beach, and no one could disappear like that. He looked around, and there was no sign of the girl. Then, in fear, Lorenzo ran back to his companion's house, and when he got there he was pale as a ghost. He even ended the story by saying, "I ain't scared of some sissy with a gun, but goddamn ghosts." The next story was told by Ethan, a gentleman who spent most of his life fishing in the river near town. His family came to visit him every week, and whenever they couldn't, they always tried to at least send him something. A card, a cake, or even a message. At 80 years old, Ethan had serious mobility problems, and spent most of the day lying down. Still, he managed to keep himself cheerful, and he was one of the dearest patients there. One of his stories was as follows: one day he took his boat and went to the river, went down the bank, put the boat in the water, and let the weak current carry him and the boat halfway down the river. He stood there for a long time, but he didn't catch any fish, and soon it started to get dark. He then felt a bump on the underside of the boat, but he didn't care, because that river has many branches stuck and loose under the water. But the bumps increased. He tried to look at the water, but due to the darkness he couldn't see anything. He sat still, and that's when something climbed into his boat. She was a woman, all wet, but she was still pretty, and she was dressed as a bride. The woman was extremely pale, and had long lank black hair. She got on the boat, sat down and said, "Don't be scared, I just want to cross the river." He doesn't know where he got the strength to row, but he rowed in silence until he reached the other side of the river. When they were almost at the edge of the river, she disappeared from the boat. He even said that he went home that night terrified, and he never stayed in the river again after 7 p.m. According to him, the neighborhood there had a good explanation for what happened. Neighbors said that in 1953 a girl from a close family wanted to marry a young man who lived on the other side of the river. So, in order to visit each other, one of the two had to cross. On their wedding day, the girl and her father overturned their boat in the water, and the father's body was found and removed from the water, but the girl's body was never found. They say that she doesn't do any harm, she just wants to get out of the water so she can get married. I've been there on that same river at night, and the feeling of not being alone is very strong. This next story happened to me. Perhaps this is because nursing homes are places where death is very common. Anyway, I had been working there for 4 months, and I already knew almost everyone who worked there. One day I had to stay late at night to check on some papers that would be delivered the next day. So when I was done, I decided to get ready to leave, but before I left, I went to the bathroom. When I walked out the bathroom door, I saw a tall woman, dressed all in white like a doctor, walking down the hall in front of me, heading towards the exit door. I didn't really care and thought it was someone else who worked there. I still greeted her and said, "What a coincidence, we're leaving at about the same time." The woman didn't even look back. So I thought she might not have heard, since the hallway leading to the exit room is long. The other day I met a colleague, who I assumed would be the person who had gone out late the night before. When I asked why she hadn't responded the night before, she said, "But I didn't stay late, I left early yesterday because I needed to pick up my daughter from school early." When I asked the guard who was on duty at that night, he informed me that that woman in white already had the habit of appearing at the office, even he had seen her many times. To this day, no one knows who is this tall woman that appears there. The next story was told by a lady named Nicole. Nicole lived in this town, on a hillside, near an old train station and the old municipal cemetery. The streets these days are full of traffic 24 hours a day. But back then, Back in the 1960s the place was much quieter and deserted at night. The railway line almost never stopped, unlike today, as the railway line is completely disabled, unfortunately. Nicole, who was used to the noise of the locomotives, was surprised when she started to wake up certain nights of the week, always around 2 in the morning, to the sound of a horse that galloped and neighed near her window. Strangely intrigued, she started waking her husband, asking if he also heard the horse. What he always told her was for her to go back to sleep because it was just a dream. What was strange is that Nicole was almost never afraid of anything, but as she said, there was something strange about that horse. As it didn't happen every night, she tried to forget about it, until at a time when that horse started waking her up every night, giving her the chills, and as always, her husband never heard it, except for the last time that it happened. That morning, by her words, her husband woke up with the noise of the mysterious horse, shivered and said, "Pray, Nicole. Pray in faith, because this is not of this world." Now with her husband's warning, Nicole was now curious to see this horse, despite lacking the courage to simply open her bedroom window and look out onto the street and see what galloped. She then told her friend Julia what happened every night and invited her to spend the night at her house, to simply see whether or not it was a simple wandering horse that escaped from someone and decided to take a walk in the street of her house. So the two agreed, and Julia began to sleep at her house for several nights. Julia was very Catholic, the kind of people who had the rosary and went to morning mass every day. One night, Nicole woke up hearing the galloping of the supposed horse in the distance, and then woke up her husband and Julia. Her husband even gave them the last warning to just pray in faith and stop wanting to see what was going on, which he ignored. Julia already had the rosary in her hand, and her eyes were wide with fear, but she said firmly, "Open the window and we will see whatever Jesus wants." So they opened the window, and saw what made me sleep with the lights on for nights. It wasn't a horse, it was a very thin old man, with his beard dragging on the ground, with pierced black eyes, and he was neighing down the hill, and worse, he didn't walk, he jumped with both legs at the same time, and instead of feet, there were hooves. When the two saw the creature coming down the middle of the street towards the window they were in, they saw Nicole's husband's arms grab them, and then he spoke to the creature, "Myuu, my brother, go your way in the name of God. Follow your path in peace." And then he closed the window. It was then that Nicole noticed that she was so afraid that there was a puddle of her own urine under her. And where was the courage to go out on the porch to get a cloth, bucket and disinfectant to clean the floor, in addition to taking a shower, since the bathroom was also outside? And Julia, she was praying one rosary after another, on her knees until dawn. Nicole said that her husband never saw what was out there, at least that's what he said. Well, after that, she said she never heard those gallops again. That was the first time I heard about the old cemetery. According to some colleagues, the old cemetery was located next to one of the biggest churches here in the city, but over time, about 30 years ago, it had been destroyed, and the bones and mausoleums there were moved to other locations. Today, in the place where the cemetery used to be, a school was built. As I was always interested in the supernatural, I always found a way to ask the people there about the old cemetery. The story was told by Molly, a lady who had a disturbing story. By all appearances, Molly was completely sober, with no sign of dementia or any kind of illness that afflicted her. At just 64 years old and almost completely independent, it was hard to imagine why she was there. According to some co-workers, Molly had a lot of money, but her children were very greedy and they forged documents and forcefully interned her there. I think it was a mixture of sadness and disgust that kept her there. God will give them what they deserve. That's what she said when someone mentioned the situation. Returning to the story, Molly told me that this story was told by her mother and uncle, who lived in front of the cemetery. At the time, she lived with her father, so she didn't witness what happened. Well then, some people were sitting quietly talking in the doorway of her mother's house, when screams were heard coming from the cemetery. It was the grave digger, who, in addition to the screams, ran desperately into the middle of the avenue, crossed the road and passed out at her mother's door. The people there quickly helped him with a glass of water. After he calmed down, he told them what had happened. He said he was cleaning around the headstones with a machete, clearing the tall weeds that were nearly covering the graves, when he felt like smoking a cigarette. He sat on top of one of the tombs and put the machete aside, took the cigarette, smoked, rested for a while, and when he reached for the machete with his hand, he noticed that it was no longer beside him. When he turned around, he saw a very dirty man and woman with very old and torn clothes, and he noticed that his machete was in this woman's hand. He looked at her in amazement, and she smiled at him. He said her mouth was rotten, her teeth were all broken, and the rotten smell she gave off was very strong. The couple had deep wounds all over their bodies, and they were extremely pale. That's why he screamed and ran out of the cemetery. Molly's uncle and the other men decided to go back there with the poor gravedigger who did not want to return to the place at all, but needed to fetch his belongings. Right at the entrance, there was a mausoleum that looked like a small house, where more than one family member is usually placed. Molly's uncle said that this grave was all closed and that it had 2 windows the size of a brick, and it was all covered with black ceramic. When the gravedigger approached it, he began to scream. And when he got ready to run, the men grabbed him and asked him to calm down and tell them what was going on. That's when he started screaming that the woman he had seen before was looking at him from the grave window and was smiling at him. The gravedigger then asked if they weren't smelling rotten flesh. One of them looked into the little window and saw absolutely nothing, but they were smelling a very strong rotten flesh smell. They took the gravedigger's things and hurried out of there. The poor gravedigger, after 12 years on the job, resigned and went a few days without going there. Until a month later, while trying to cross the same avenue in front of the cemetery, when a car ran over him and he died. The stories surrounding that cemetery were many. The next story came from a gentleman named Douglas. Douglas was a 75-year-old man who was in the early stages of dementia. Despite this, he was a cheerful man, and he was there mainly for financial reasons and lack of family members willing to take care of him. According to him, the distance from school to his house was 12 kilometers, so he always went there on his bicycle. On the way, he used to go through the old cemetery, because it saved a lot of time. On that particular day, as usual, because of sports activities, he went home later, and when he got to the part where he had to cross the cemetery, it was already 10 p.m. As he was used to, he quietly rode his bicycle through the cemetery. He suddenly smelled incense in the air, and on the way he found a tomb with a photo of a girl. So he concluded that the smell of incense was coming from that girl's grave. He continued the path pedaling the bicycle. Shortly after that, the bicycle pedal became heavy, and even with more strain on the legs, the bicycle did not pick up speed. That was weird, so he thought, "Am I tired?" But it could be. Then he noticed something strange. He felt like he was being hugged from behind. And when he noticed, there were 2 little arms of a child hugging him around the waist as if the child was sitting on the back of the bicycle. And at that moment everything went cold, and the child's hands were white and pale. He started to pedal harder to get out of that place, but the bicycle wouldn't go. Then the child's hands went sliding down his arms and held the brakes of the bicycle, making it stop. He was sweating with terror. He thought, "Is it the girl in the photo that was in the grave?" When he looked back, in a horrifying way he saw that it really was that little girl who was there. So he jumped and ran, pushing the bicycle with his eyes closed in terror, managing to get out of that spot. As soon as he left the cemetery, he felt the air around him heat up. He opened his eyes and looked around but saw no one. He mounted his bicycle and set off at full speed. Luckily, he managed to get home without falling off his bicycle. The next day, when he went to school, he crossed the cemetery again, but during the day. He then looked for that little girl's grave. When he arrived at the place where he had seen that grave with the girl's photo, there was nothing there. There was only an empty land. To this day he doesn't know what that little girl wanted, or what she wanted to say, and how that grave that was there that night just disappeared, leaving no signs of its existence. The next story was told by a lady named Martha. She says that one day, she had gone to a doctor's appointment with her mother and sister, and the clinic was close to the train station. The appointment was late, at 6 p.m. She was already sleepy when her mother finished consulting. It was approximately 8 p.m. and the street was completely deserted. So they went to the taxi stand. Near the stand, about 200 feet away, was the old cemetery. They were talking to pass the time, and that's when they noticed, in the distance, the figure of a man approaching from the sidewalk. It wouldn't be a big deal, if not for the fact that from a distance, he already appeared to be quite tall, as if he were riding a horse. Soon they began to hear his footsteps. It was unbelievable. He was just over 7 feet tall, wearing a hat and a black coat. As he passed them, Martha noticed that in his face there was no life at all. He looked like a wax doll with big black eyes. Martha thought, it's a bad joke made by some idle man. Her mom then yelled, "Don't stare at him. It is the guardian of evil souls. Pray, my children. Pray." Desperate, with their eyes avoiding him, the three prayed, exchanging words, but without stopping. He then gave a terrible roar, which sounded like an ox being butchered alive. Martha's mother nearly lost consciousness, and Martha was shaking from head to toe. Suddenly, a very strong wind lifted the dust from the ground in a kind of whirlpool and a devilish spectre dissolved. A smell of rotten stuff filled all the air around them. Her mother pulled Martha and her sister by their arms and the three ran to the next block, where they could already see other people. When other people saw them arriving scared, they immediately asked, "What's wrong?" Her mother looked at her as if to say, "Be careful what you say." Martha then said, "We were nearly robbed." Some of the people around them looked suspicious. I believe their eyes showed to these people that what she said was not the truth. This last story was told by an 85-year-old man named Richard. Richard was one of the most miserable patients there. With his health deteriorating, he had been mistreated by one of his caregivers at another nursing home. Furthermore, he had been completely disowned by his family, and was there simply waiting for his own death. When I questioned him about the old cemetery, he told me this story. Many years ago, Richard was in love with a girl, Cecil, who also seemed to respond to this feeling, but she belonged to a rich and traditional family, while he was from a humble family and worked helping his father at a wood mill. Even so, young Cecil was secretly meeting with him. One day, they agreed to run away together. Richard, with great sacrifice, managed to save a little money and bought a ring with a small sapphire, a very simple one, just to seal the engagement with his beloved. However, on the night scheduled for the escape, Cecil did not appear. Richard waited a long time, in vain. Distressed, the other day he sneaked up to the villa where the girl lived. He was surprised and disappointed to find a large party celebrating Cecil's marriage to a wealthy man in the capital. The girl was making fun of him all the time. Blind with pain and dazed, Richard ran back down the road, entered his house, grabbed his father's revolver, and ran to the cemetery, where he intended to commit suicide. Once there, he ran to the back, and stopped among the trees next to some time-blackened tombs. Just as he was about to fire the gun at his own head, the full moon came out from behind the clouds and illuminated a nearby tomb, where there was a portrait of a young woman, already yellow with age. Richard was impressed by the beauty of that face and came closer. Her name was Rosie and she had died in 1878 at the age of 18. Sitting on the grave, Richard began to cry profusely, but he couldn't take his eyes off that face. A mixture of comfort and attraction invaded him, and he began to feel better, causing him to throw the gun away, disgusted with his own cowardice. Then he remembered about the ring with the little sapphire inside his pocket, and placed it on the grave, saying, "Take it, be my bride. You must deserve what the other one didn't want." And then he went home. From that night onwards, Richard began to feel great peace in his heart and began an intense relationship with Rosie. Every day after work he would go to the cemetery, clean the grave, talk to her, and bring her fresh flowers. The ring he had left on the grave was gone, and he naturally thought someone had stolen it. One night, Richard woke up in his room smelling the soft scent of roses. When he opened his eyes, he saw at the foot of his bed the delicate figure of a young woman, with a flowing dress, silky hair flowing, in the midst of a very clear and soft light. Then he recognized the features. It was Rosie. She then reached her hand out, where the small sapphire ring that Richard had left on her grave gleamed. And then she said, "I accept, Richard. I'll be your bride, come with me, my love." Ecstatic, he hugged her, kissed her madly, and the two made love, sealing their union. The story, while beautiful, earned Richard the nickname of Ghost Fucker among the staff. I believe that 2 weeks after hearing this story, my time there was over and I got my nursing degree. Years later, in 2005, I was talking on the phone with one of my friends I had met there. I hadn't talked to him since that time. And then he told me the following. "Anon, do you remember Richard? So, he died here of natural causes. 2 people were with him when he was dying. You won't believe what happened. These people said that just before he died the room got ice cold, and his last words were, 'You came, my love.'